After midnight on Saturday, October 19th, 2013, a 23-year-old man named Ode Egilus stood at the bar in a packed dance club in Antwerp, Belgium. The bartender slid 2 shot glasses across the bar towards Ode, and he grabbed both of them, he held one, and he handed the other to his friend, Kevin Rodriguez Fuentes, who was standing right behind him. It was Kevin's birthday. So Ode raised his shot glass and shouted happy birthday in Spanish over the pounding dance music, and then the 2 young men slammed back their drinks. Ode had moved to Antwerp, Belgium from Spain about 6 months earlier when he had gotten a job as a computer engineer. When he'd arrived, he hadn't known anybody. But he'd met Kevin at a beer festival, and the 2 of them had gotten along right away. And Kevin was from the area, so he'd introduced Ode to a bunch of his friends and shown him the best spots to hang out in the city, and the 2 had gotten very close very quickly. Now, standing at the bar after, taking their shots, Kevin tapped on Ode's shoulder and he pointed out at the dance floor and he grinned because there was a group of young women about their age all dancing together out there. And so the 2 young men, they headed out to the dance floor to go speak with these girls. And from this point on, the night really became a blur for Ode, who kept going back and forth from the dance floor back to the bar for more drinks. But, despite that, Ode was having a great time. It was really nights like this that made him feel like Antwerp was his new home. But he also knew if he stayed out much longer here, he might end up passing out right on the dance floor. So Ode and Kevin and some friends they'd just met on the dance floor stumbled out of the club and into the city. When they got out there, the streets were pretty empty. And so Ode reflexively pulled his phone out of his pocket and looked at the time. Now, his vision was fuzzy, but even still, one-eyeing it, he could see that it was close to 4 a.m. And given the fact that it was so late, basically it was the next day at this point, he just told the group good night, and then he turned around to start walking home to go to bed. The next morning, Ode's friend, Kevin, woke up with a pounding headache. His eyes fluttered open and he looked around and he let out a sigh of relief because he was safely in his bedroom in his apartment in Antwerp. He had been so drunk by the end of his birthday celebration the night before that he literally didn't remember getting home. And so now, painfully, he rolled over and grabbed his phone off the nightstand and reflexively texted Ode, along with another friend that had been out with him the night before, asking how they were feeling. The other friend texted right back, but Ode did not respond. But this didn't really worry Kevin that much. I mean, he's horribly hungover, Ode has to be as well, and so he likely is just sleeping it off, and he'll be in touch when he wakes up. However, all day that day, Kevin did not hear from Ode. And then the next day, October 20th, when still Kevin has not heard from Ode, he really started to get worried. But when Kevin called Ode to check on him to make sure he was okay, when he put the phone to his ear, it didn't ring. Instead, it went straight to Ode's voicemail, like his phone was turned off. And to Kevin, this was pretty unusual. Ode was usually very responsive, even with a hangover. And by this point, Kevin had given him a full day, 24 hours to recover, he should be in touch by now. What's going on? So Kevin called the other friend who they'd gone out with, who had texted him back the day before, to see if maybe Ode had checked in with him. But that friend said he also had not spoken to Ode. And so at this point, Kevin hung up and just decided to go to Ode's house and literally physically check on him. However, when Kevin arrived at Ode's house, he found Ode's roommates, but no Ode. Ode's roommates did not know Ode very well, so they didn't know what was sort of normal and not normal behavior. So when he had gone out for Kevin's birthday party and didn't come back, they just figured he was crashing at a friend's place or something. But to Kevin, this was unusual. To hear that he had not come back, that was not normal. He would know if, Ode was at a friend's house. And so Kevin was starting to panic. But then Kevin remembered one of his and Ode's mutual friends had recently gone out of town for a wedding. And so Kevin thought, maybe that's where Ode is. He's gone with her to the wedding, and that's why he's not here, and that's why he's not answering his phone. So Kevin left Ode's house and called this friend, a young woman whose name was Oyane. He was hoping that she would have an explanation for everything, but instead, when she answered the phone, it was obvious from her voice that she was also freaking out about Ode. Oyane said she also had been calling Ode nonstop over the past day or so, and she couldn't get in touch with him. And so it was becoming clear that nobody had seen Ode since the night of the birthday party when he set off around 4 a.m. to walk home drunk from the bar. Kevin had no idea what he was supposed to do, but he felt like his friend was in trouble. So he contacted the police and officially reported Ode missing. The following day, Monday, October 21st, Kevin sat in a small room across from members of the missing persons unit of the Belgian National Police. And as soon as the officers started asking Kevin questions, it became clear that this was going to be a very frustrating meeting for everybody. because no matter how hard Kevin tried, he literally couldn't remember much at all. His memory of his and O'Day's night out on his birthday were really just blurry images and pieces of random conversations because, he was drunk. But Kevin did manage to remember what O'Day had been wearing. He had a gray hooded sweatshirt and a black and white checkered scarf. And he also knew the area of town specifically where they had gone out. But really, that was it. And so by the time Kevin left the police station, he felt like he was really letting his friend down. And he just couldn't handle the idea that now he would just have to sit around and wait and hope police magically found him, when right now, O'Day, wherever he was, could be in trouble or hurt or something. He just felt like he had to do something. So that afternoon, Kevin met up with some of O'Day's other friends, and together, they began hanging posters all around the city that had pictures of O'Day on them. Antwerp was a very busy city, filled with bars and restaurants that stayed open very late, so they were sure that somebody had to have seen O'Day while he was walking home. He couldn't have just disappeared into thin air. People don't do that. Meanwhile, detectives in the missing persons unit got to work. Now, Kevin had not given them a ton to go on, but knowing where in the city he and O'Day had gone out and what O'Day had been wearing did actually turn out to be quite helpful. Because with this basic information, police were able to collect CCTV surveillance camera footage from outside of the bars, restaurants, and street corners where Kevin and O'Day had been. And it didn't take them long to pick up on O'Day's trail. The investigators were hoping to find footage of O'Day getting into a cab or some other vehicle, or maybe wandering into a building, or even evidence that he'd been attacked in some capacity. And at first, they thought that is exactly what they'd found, because on camera footage around 4 a.m. on the morning O'Day disappeared, the police saw him wandering down this dimly lit side street on his own. His black and white checkered scarf really jumped out on the footage, and the police watched on video as this man suddenly came out of the shadows and rushed O'Day. The man attacked O'Day and stole what looked like O'Day's wallet right out of his pocket, and then the man took off running. And as disturbing as it was, the footage did not actually surprise the investigators very much. While Antwerp was not a particularly violent place, it was a big city, and drunk people wandering home at night did occasionally get mugged. However, what the investigators saw next on the surveillance footage did completely shock them, because after the mugging, O'Day had pulled himself together and kept heading down the street. And on footage taken a few minutes later from a different camera, the police saw O'Day still wandering on his own when suddenly 2 new men rushed up, attacked O'Day, took his phone, and then they ran away. Meaning, in the span of just a few minutes, O'Day had been mugged twice by 3 different people. And none of the investigators had ever seen anything like that. It was like something you'd expect to see in a movie or a TV show about a guy cursed with bad luck or something. But as bizarre as this was, investigators now had something to go on. They didn't know if these muggers, the 3 men, were connected in some way, or if this had truly been 2 random, unconnected muggings. But O'Day's cell phone and wallet had been stolen by these guys. So they could track O'Day's cell phone data and also his credit card info, and the investigators hoped that would then lead them right to O'Day's attackers, and they could figure out what their affiliation was and why they targeted O'Day, and hopefully where O'Day is now. The investigators' plan took a few days, but it did pay off in a big way. By tracking O'Day's credit card, investigators discovered that somebody had attempted to use one of his cards at an ATM in the city. And so they pulled surveillance footage from that ATM to identify the first mugger. Then, by using cell phone tower data and CCTV footage along the route where they saw his cell phone was taken, investigators were able to identify the other 2 attackers involved in the second mugging. And so now, they believed they just needed to talk to these thieves to figure out where O'Day was. Fast forward to October 29th, 10 days after O'Day's disappearance, and he still is nowhere to be found. Officers from the missing persons unit interviewed these 3 muggers separately. The police made it clear that they had a pile of evidence here that showed they mugged O'Day shortly before he vanished, so there's no point in trying to deny it. They know what they did. And none of the muggers did try to deny it. In fact, all 3 men admitted that they had jumped O'Day on the street, and they told the police exactly what they had stolen. But they insisted their attacks, the 2 muggings, were not coordinated at all. They just happened to have gotten to O'Day within a few minutes of each other. And then even more importantly, they also all insisted that they had nothing to do with O'Day's disappearance. All they did was rob him, that's it. As the investigators listened to these muggers talk, all they could do was stare in disbelief. The idea that 3 muggers had randomly committed 2 attacks on the same man within minutes of each other and that their victim had then disappeared in yet another unrelated incident, seemed almost comical. But no matter how hard the police pressed these guys, they all completely stuck to their stories, which was, we mugged him, and then we ran away and we never saw him again. The police arrested and held all three men in connection to the robberies that they admitted to doing. But their goal, despite what these men have said, was to find enough evidence to still charge them with the kidnapping, or maybe even murder, of O'Day. But then, a new piece of surveillance footage surfaced from a new camera. And this new footage actually showed O'Day moments after the second mugging. And on this footage, investigators didn't see any of the muggers dragging O'Day away or something. Instead, just like the muggers said, they really did take off after that second mugging. And just like he'd done after the first attack, O'Day dusted himself off and just kept on walking down the street and out of the camera's range, but he was alone. And so now, to their complete astonishment, the police had to admit that the muggers might be telling the truth, and that O'Day could have just kept wandering the streets of Antwerp for hours after he'd gotten attacked. They didn't know, but they know the muggers ran away and O'Day was alone, at least briefly after the second attack. And also, this new footage made them realize that to really conduct this investigation, they were going to need to search the entire city to see if anyone, anywhere, had seen O'Day. So, in early November of 2013, about 2 weeks after O'Day's disappearance, Belgium National Police conducted a massive investigation throughout all of Antwerp. They visited all the bars, all the restaurants, all the clubs in the area roughly where O'Day and his friends had been out partying. But no matter who they spoke to, no matter where they went, nobody knew where O'Day was or what happened to him. But as they hit all these dead ends, the investigators' search continued, and it sort of slowly migrated north through Antwerp in the rough direction where O'Day had been last seen walking, away from the city center and towards the banks of the River Scheldt, which runs right through Antwerp on its way to the North Sea. On the evening of November 7th, so by this point it is 19 days since O'Day was last seen, several detectives from the Missing Persons Unit stepped onto the deck of a very unique structure that literally floated on the River Scheldt. The structure was called the Bod Boat. That morning, police boats had been dragging the river itself and were searching the riverbanks with dogs, looking for any signs of O'Day. But the search of this river couldn't be completed without a stop at the Bod Boat. So the Bod Boat was basically a massive club, bar, and high-end restaurant that had been built into a converted ship that was moored right in the middle of the stretch of the river that police were dragging. But the biggest attraction of the Bod Boat was not the food or the dancing. It was the almost Olympic-sized swimming pool that had been built into the deck of the ship, and it looked like it was floating right on top of the river. People referred to it as the world's largest floating swimming pool, and it was always packed. The Bod Boat had a very good, very wide, unobstructed view of the city and the river. And so the detectives were hopeful that if O'Day had passed by, someone on the Bod Boat likely would have been able to see him. So now the detectives split up and began interviewing the Bod Boat staff and the patrons, asking if any of them remembered seeing a young man in a distinctive black and white checkered scarf on the morning he went missing. Now, at this point, pretty much everybody in the city had already heard of O'Day. I mean, his face was plastered on posters everywhere, and people really wanted to help. But as detectives talked to everybody at the Bod Boat, and the pool, and the bar, and the restaurant, everybody, as much as people wanted to help and thought they might have tips that could help, nobody had anything that was meaningful. And so eventually, the investigators had to leave the Bod Boat, and they just spent the rest of the afternoon on the banks of the river, watching the Marine unit do its work. But just like on the Bod Boat, there was nothing found in the river itself. On November 19th, 2013, so now 1 full month after O'Day's disappearance, friends and family gathered publicly, both in Antwerp and his hometown in the Basque country of Spain. In Spain, his family made it clear that they still hoped O'Day would be alive, and that this gathering was not a memorial. It was instead to show their love for O'Day and to bring continued attention to his story so he could be found. In Antwerp, O'Day's friends tried to convey the same message with their meetup, that O'Day had to be out there somewhere and he might be okay. We just need to keep looking. However, by the end of 2013, so now over 2 months after O'Day's disappearance, it became clear that the police investigation was really not making much headway at all. Police still had those 3 muggers in custody in hopes that maybe they would crack and they would admit that they had done something to O'Day after the muggings. But the 3 men had not changed their stories at all. And also, after over a month of canvassing the entire city, no new evidence had really surfaced at all. And so O'Day's friends and family really began to worry that the police might just abandon the search because there was nothing they could do. But then, starting in the early summer of 2014, so a little more than 7 months after O'Day first disappeared, something incredible happened. O'Day's story went viral, and not just in Belgium or in his native Spain, but all across Europe. And this really is not how things typically played out. Thousands of people go missing in Europe every year, and most of those cases go relatively unnoticed by the media and the general public. It just is what it is. But the story of this young man who had moved to Antwerp to start his career and a new life, only to vanish without a trace after being mugged twice in the middle of the night, it just seemed so unbelievable and also resonated with people everywhere. It just felt so tragic. And so as the police, who by this point really had throttled back their search quite a bit, I mean, it's been 7 months by now, as police were showing signs of just basically dropping the case, people all across the continent demanded the police not just continue, but increase their scrutiny. Look everywhere, triple your efforts, find O'Day. And so there's all this unbelievable international outpouring of support from this viral story. I mean, you had poets all over the world writing poems about O'Day, and you had musicians writing music about O'Day. You had charity groups coming out in Belgium and doing their own search for O'Day. I mean, it's like the whole world was rallying to get the Belgian government to act. Like, triple your efforts, find O'Day, he's out there. And then what sort of pushed it over the edge was in October of 2014, as the first anniversary of O'Day's disappearance approached, one of the most famous soccer players in the world, Cristiano Ronaldo, played a game with images of O'Day on his jersey. I mean, his story really had reached basically everyone. And it was at this point that Belgium did act. The Belgium National Police literally doubled down on their efforts to search the entire country for O'Day. They're not just looking in Antwerp anymore, they're going to look everywhere. They also enlisted the help of Interpol, an international police organization, to expand the search to other European countries. And so throughout 2014 and into 2015, investigators in Antwerp revisited bars, restaurants they had gone to during their initial canvass, and they re-interviewed people connected to O'Day. They also made public announcements to let people know they were still looking for O'Day. But despite all this effort, despite really doing their absolute best to find O'Day, they couldn't find him. But then on September 18th, 2015, so 1 year and 11 months after O'Day's disappearance, something happened with the bod boat that changed everything. So to understand what happened, you need to take into account the literal design of the bod boat. So the bod boat really was, this entertainment hub that had been installed in this decommissioned boat. But the boat is not like a boat that we think of when we think of a huge ship or something where there's multiple stories and a huge deep keel that goes beneath the surface of the water. Instead, it was more like a big floating dock, almost like a catamaran-style boat, where it's sort of one level, this big rectangular square, and there really is nothing below the surface. It's more like a big floating dock. That was the bod boat. And on September 18th, 2015, the swimming pool on the bod boat began to leak. Now, remember, you're looking out at the bod boat from land, and it basically looks like a big floating dock with all these attractions on it, including a pool. And so even though you'd see the surface of the swimming pool being at level with everything else, basically right at the top of the river, well, there's a recessed portion that effectively touches down into the river. And so at some point, there's a leak that formed on the base of this pool, and the pool began taking on all this extra water, and the pool literally broke off from the bod boat structure, and it sank to the bottom of the river. Now, luckily, no one had gotten hurt when this happened, but the story had taken over the news. The bod boat was a huge attraction for people in Antwerp, as well as for tourists visiting the city, and so the city immediately began working to come up with a plan to resurface the swimming pool and rebuild the bod boat. Finally, on February 11th, 2016, so almost 2.5 years after O'Day's disappearance and 5 months after the swimming pool sunk, 2 cranes attached to a boat were brought in to latch onto the base of this pool at the bottom of the river and try to resurface it. And on that afternoon, a member of the work crew stood on the boat, watching the water and helping oversee everything as the cranes slowly did their work. And as he kept his eyes trained on the water, eventually, the bod boat's swimming pool, which was still actually mostly intact, broke the surface. And as this happened, a few of the workers let out a cheer, but something in the water caught the crew member's attention. At first he couldn't tell what it was, but when he leaned down to get a better look, he immediately shouted for the crane operator to stop. The cranes fell silent, and with shaking hands, the crew member took out his phone and called the police. Eventually, once they put all the evidence together, this is what police believe happened to O'Day on the early morning of October 19th, 2013. At around 4 a.m., after leaving his friends, O'Day began his walk home. And like the police already knew, he was mugged twice in a matter of minutes. But after the second mugging, he really did pick himself up and sort of collect himself, and very likely he was hurt, he was scared, and he was very drunk, so likely disoriented, doesn't know if there are more threats coming, doesn't really understand what's even happening, but he needs to get home. And we know he continued trying to walk home for some time, because eventually he came in contact with a group of strangers who would eventually come forward and confirm this. But they apparently saw this guy who looked beat up and disoriented. It was O'Day, and they called out to him and tried to convince him to let them book him a cab to get him home. But he was so disoriented and so drunk, he didn't even answer them and he just walked off. But at that point, he had moved fairly far north in the city, and he was getting near the banks of the River Scheldt. So for reference, he had walked pretty far off course. He was not near his home. He was clearly lost. And at some point in his disoriented, scared, drunken state, he tripped and actually fell into the river. Now, the shock of landing in the water likely, potentially sobered him up a little bit, but he was really, really drunk. And so even if he had tried to swim and get to shore, there was a strong enough current that it would have been fairly difficult to get out of the water. And so the current ended up pulling him all the way up against the side of the bodboat. And so once he was there, kind of pinned against the side of the bodboat, right on the side of the bodboat where that swimming pool was, he was too weak and drunk to swim out of the current. And so he just kind of being pressed up against the wall of the side of the bodboat until he had no more energy left to fight, and he was slowly pulled under the surface and forced underneath the bodboat, specifically to the bottom of the recess of the swimming pool, where there's not much space between the bottom of the pool and the bottom of the river. And so he basically got pulled down and got wedged right in that space underneath the pool of the bodboat, and there he drowned. And for more than 2 years after his death, O'Day's body remained wedged underneath that swimming pool. And so for all that time, people are swimming in the pool, not realizing they're a couple feet away from a dead body. But then finally, the swimming pool, sunk to the bottom. It was pulled back up by those cranes, and attached to it at this point was O'Day's body. And that was how they found him. The muggers who attacked O'Day were ultimately convicted of robbery, and they all served approximately 4 years in prison. Now, the muggers were never actually shown to have any direct connection to O'Day's death. And while authorities believe the most likely scenario is that O'Day simply fell into the water, they were never able to officially rule out foul play. O'Day's parents have called for further investigation. Early on the morning of August 19, 1991, a 32-year-old man named Bobby Curley stood in his recently renovated kitchen in the city of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. He walked over to his fridge, opened it up, reached inside, and grabbed his bag lunch along with his thermos, and he was just about to head out the door and go to work, but he stopped and gave his wife Joanne a kiss on the cheek and said he loved her, and then he left for the day. So Bobby and Joanne had been married for a year, and they lived with Joanne's 4-year-old daughter, Angela, in a duplex in a working-class neighborhood. Bobby was an electrician, and so he made pretty good money, but the Curleys were by no means rich. However, Bobby knew that actually might change soon, because Joanne was on the verge of winning this big court settlement. Joanne had actually been married once before, but her husband had died in a car accident about 3 years ago. His car had collided with a tractor trailer, and the driver of that tractor trailer was eventually found to be the one at fault. And so now, Joanne's lawyers and the trucking company's lawyers were finally closing in on a financial settlement to compensate Joanne for her first husband's wrongful death. It had been a really stressful process, and Bobby had definitely noticed that Joanne had been more sullen and stressed than usual as they were going through it. But now that the case was finally wrapping up, Joanne did appear to be sort of back in good spirits, and, while nothing was official yet, it looked like they were going to receive approximately $1 million in compensation, which was obviously really exciting. In fact, the two of them were already mapping out how they might spend some of this money. Some of the ideas they had come up with included taking Angela on a few big trips, and also maybe using some of that money to finally fund Bobby having his own business, something he had always wanted to do, but lacked the resources for. But for now, the settlement was not complete, and so Bobby had to go to his normal 9 to 5 and, punch the clock and keep earning money for the family. So for today, once he was outside, he simply got into his car and made the short drive to his current job site. 10 minutes later, Bobby parked outside of a science building on the campus of Wilkes University, which was a small college in Wilkes-Barre. He saw some of the guys on his crew standing out front, waiting to be let into this building. So Bobby, who was the foreman of their crew, he got out of his car and said good morning to everyone and then walked up and unlocked the doors. Then they all went inside and got to work. And working at this location had really become a pretty big routine for this group, because by now, Bobby and his crew had been coming here, working here for a few months now. And this job was a really big job. Bobby and his team were helping renovate the entire building, which included all the classrooms, all the laboratories, hallways, everything. And so they still had quite a bit of work to do. But there was another reason this job was taking as long as it was. And that was because when Bobby's crew had first shown up at the building, they had expected it to be totally prepared for them, meaning all furniture and equipment would be cleared out. But instead, they found a ton of stuff just kind of everywhere inside the building, because the building clearly had not been prepped at all. The chemistry lab, for example, still had random flasks and chemical bottles and, wet rags with weird substances on them just laying around the room. So as a result, Bobby and his crew had been forced to do a ton of cleanup, before they even got into their jobs that they had not planned on, and it really set them back. And so now, just to stay on schedule, they were regularly putting in 12-hour days basically every day they were there. And so all these extra hours had Bobby feeling completely exhausted, and lately, he had sort of felt kind of sick almost, and he just sort of chalked that up to basically overworking. But Bobby never complained. The overtime pay was great, and he really enjoyed working with these particular guys on this crew. These guys were basically his friends. So normally, the long work days were actually kind of fun, as exhausting and awful as they were. Later that afternoon, Bobby was standing on a ladder inside of that chemistry lab, running electrical wires above the ceiling panels. And as he was doing that, he suddenly heard this loud commotion coming from across the room. Bobby realized what he was hearing were guys on his crew basically shouting and laughing. So he climbed down to see what was going on. And when he walked over there, he saw that everybody was gathered around one of the members of the crew, whose name was Sammy DePasquale. And Sammy was sort of doubled over, coughing and spitting and holding a Coke can in his hand. Another member of the crew, whose name was Robert Marconi, explained to Bobby when he walked over that somebody had swapped out Sammy's Coke with a different Coke can, one that was filled with chewing tobacco spit instead of soda. Bobby cringed. This was absolutely disgusting. Even as a prank, this was awful. But it was also sort of par for the course for the guys on Bobby's crew. This is sort of what they did. They were always playing pranks on each other to kind of lighten the mood on long work days like today. And everybody was laughing, even Sammy, who'd been the butt of the joke. And so eventually, Bobby joined in too. He thought that this was ultimately good for morale, as gross as it was. And after a minute or so, Sammy recovered from his coughing fit from drinking this disgusting liquid and vowed sort of comically to get payback on whoever switched his Coke can. Then after that, all the guys got back to work. And so Bobby, he left the group and went back over to his ladder. And as he was climbing back up, he paused about halfway because he felt this sudden wave of sickness come over him. It almost felt like he had a flu coming on, which didn't really surprise him because he had been doing all these overtime hours and he really had felt run down as a result of it. And so again, he's just sort of chalking up the way he feels to overworking. And so as Bobby is standing on this ladder, he kind of told himself, just suck it up, this will pass. And he just stood there on the ladder. And after a minute or two, that sensation of being sick did sort of pass. And then, because he was not a complainer, he was a hardworking guy, he just pushed the sickness feeling he was having out of his mind. He climbed back up and got back to doing his wiring. But 4 days later, on the morning of Friday, August 23rd, Bobby felt worse than ever. As he made his way across the college parking lot towards the science building where his crew was still working, he felt like his feet were heavy and he was constantly short of breath. And then as the workday went on, continuing to run wires in that chem lab, Bobby got really sweaty and really hot. His coworkers noticed and kept coming up to him to ask if he needed to go home early. But even though Bobby totally did need to go home early and felt awful, he would just tell them nope, he was just fine. And so Bobby would manage to get through that particular workday. But then at the end of the day, when it was time to go home, Bobby felt so relieved. He could not wait to just get home, crawl into bed, and sleep. But by the next morning, Saturday morning, that heavy feeling in Bobby's feet had turned into this really intense burning pain that actually went all the way up his legs. And then his hands went numb. At this point, Bobby had to admit to himself that this was not a symptom of overworking. He was sick, like something was wrong with him. So he went to his doctor. But the doctor told him that despite what he was feeling, the symptoms were not that serious. Like it didn't appear that something was seriously wrong with him. And so ultimately, he just told Bobby to, go home and get more rest. That's what you need right now. So that's exactly what Bobby did. For the rest of that Saturday and all day the next day, Sunday, Bobby didn't do anything except lay in bed. But by that Sunday evening, Bobby still felt horrible. So he picked up the phone and did something that Bobby basically never did. He called one of his coworkers and told them that unfortunately, he would not be able to come to work tomorrow. When Bobby woke up the next morning, on Monday morning, the day he had taken off from work, he was in so much pain that he couldn't even stand up on his own. His wife, Joanne, tried to help him get out of bed and go to the bathroom, but he was physically too heavy for her to lift. And so Joanne actually ended up calling Bobby's brother, David, to come over the house and help. But even with David there, who could now basically help move Bobby around the house, it was very clear to Bobby that whatever was happening to him was not some minor issue. Like this was serious, and it clearly was not going away with rest like the doctor had said it would. And so at some point that day, the family called an ambulance, which came and took Bobby to a nearby hospital. But by the time they got there, the pain in Bobby's legs had gotten so bad that Bobby was literally periodically screaming in pain, and he also had begun to vomit. But after several hours of nonstop pain and nonstop testing at the hospital doctors came into Bobby's room and they told him and his family that they actually had good news. They knew what was wrong with Bobby, and it was treatable. They diagnosed him with something called Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is a condition where the body's immune system attacks the nerves and causes tingling in the feet and hands. But the staff assured Bobby that all he needed was a very specific medication, and then he would feel a whole lot better. Bobby was incredibly relieved, as was his family, and that day he began taking the medication, and quickly his pain became tolerable, he stopped vomiting, and before long, he actually felt good enough that he was able to go home. It seemed like Bobby had really turned a corner here, and that everything really was going to be okay. But within just a few days of being back home again, Bobby's pain came back even worse than before, despite still taking this medication. And he also began experiencing a new symptom. His hair started falling out. On September 7th, so now a week and a half after Bobby came back from the hospital, well, he was back there again. And to Bobby's horror, this time, his doctors actually seemed kind of baffled by his symptoms. They told him that sudden extreme hair loss was definitely not a symptom of Guillain-Barré syndrome. So they told Bobby that it seemed like their initial diagnosis must have been wrong, despite the fact that the medication they gave him to treat GBS had helped him for a little while. And so the problem now was the doctors were basically at a total loss as to how to help Bobby. They really didn't know what was going on. And so for the next 9 days, doctors ran test after test on Bobby, and all the while, Bobby's pain intensified so much and became so constant that he basically fell into this almost delirious state, like the pain was completely too much. And then eventually, all these doctors who ran all these tests came back to Bobby and his family, and they just told them that we don't know what's wrong. Like all these tests did not provide any clarity, and so basically we can't help you. And they told Bobby that now the only choice was he needed to be transferred to a bigger, more specialized medical facility in Hershey, Pennsylvania, which was about 100 miles away from Wilkes-Barre. A few days later, a neurologist named Dr. Robert Brennan walked down the hallway of the bigger hospital in Hershey, Pennsylvania. He was heading to the room where his patient, Bobby Curley, was staying. And even from several yards down the hallway, Dr. Brennan could already hear Bobby screaming and cursing at the nurses. Ever since Bobby had arrived at this hospital, his behavior had gotten more and more unhinged. At one point, Bobby had even thrown medical equipment across the room. And so now Dr. Brennan had to keep Bobby physically restrained to his bed. And so Dr. Brennan, when he reached Bobby's room, took a deep breath out in the hallway, and then into the room he walked. And inside, he saw Bobby strapped down to the bed, and he was screaming and thrashing around violently. And Dr. Brennan found himself just feeling awful about it. I mean, he felt really bad for Bobby. But really, he didn't know what to do for Bobby. He and his staff had tried basically everything they could think of to try to treat Bobby's pain, but nothing had worked. And so, on this day, Dr. Brennan couldn't do anything except what he normally did, which was just stand in Bobby's room sort of helplessly as Bobby screamed and flailed in pain. But on September 22nd, so 6 days after Bobby arrived in Hershey, he finally fell silent, because on that day, he slipped into a coma. 3 days later, Dr. Brennan felt very defeated as he stepped into Bobby's hospital room. There, he saw 5 members of Bobby's family: his wife Joanne, his 4-year-old stepdaughter Angela, Bobby's adult siblings Susan and David, and Bobby's elderly mother Mary. They'd all come to be with Bobby after he had fallen into this coma. Now, they looked up at Dr. Brennan expectantly. And Dr. Brennan, he took a deep breath, and he said he had some bad news. New test results had come back, and now, based on those results, they knew what was wrong with Bobby. Dr. Brennan told the family that what Bobby was suffering from was something called thallium toxicity. And when he said this, Dr. Brennan watched the family for some kind of a reaction. But the family just stared blankly at him like they had no idea what that meant. So Dr. Brennan went on and explained that thallium is an extremely toxic chemical. In fact, it can kill anyone who touches it, ingests it, or even just inhales its fumes. And he told them that, this is really unusual because thallium is highly controlled in the United States. It's actually banned in household products. So this is not a chemical that, Bobby just could have accidentally stumbled upon. This is pretty rare. And so at this point, Dr. Brennan just paused and let the family sit with this new information. And the family, they looked at each other like, wow, this is awful, but nobody knew how to react. They just kind of looked back at the doctor, waiting for him to explain more. But when the doctor didn't say anything, Bobby's sister, Susan, just asked in a quavering voice, what can we do? At that point, Dr. Brennan just shook his head and said, unfortunately, there's no cure for thallium poisoning. 2 days later, on September 27th, Joanne stood next to her unconscious husband in the hospital, and she nodded at the medical staff that was gathered all around him. It was ultimately Joanne's decision whether or not to keep Bobby on life support. But with no hope of a cure, Joanne had ultimately decided that the best thing to do was to take him off life support. And so after giving the signal to medical staff, Joanne, her daughter, and the rest of Bobby's family, they kind of stepped back from the bed, and they watched as the staff walked over and removed Bobby's ventilator. And then Joanne had to watch as her husband took his final breath. On the evening of October 21st, 1991, so about a month after Bobby died from thallium poisoning, a police detective named Harold Curley sat at a big table with 7 other men inside of a steakhouse in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. The other men were a mixture of coroners and investigators from all across Pennsylvania. Some were from the Hershey area, where Bobby had died. The rest, like Curley, worked for the police in Wilkes-Barre, where Bobby had lived. The men were there discussing the investigation into Bobby's death, and they had been doing this for the past 3 hours already, because there really was so much to talk about. They had already covered Bobby's initial autopsy results, which showed that he had a staggering 900 times the lethal limit of thallium in his system when he died. And so they were working under the assumption that Bobby must have been poisoned by a single massive dose of thallium. Whether accidentally or on purpose, they didn't know. And so they discussed theories for how this could have even happened to him. Because remember, thallium is not just a chemical you can get from the store. This is something that is highly regulated. So how did he come in contact with it? Their first thought had been basically what everybody else suspected, which was, Bobby must have been accidentally poisoned at the Wilkes University chemistry lab where he'd been working for so many months. and they actually had a bunch of records from a preliminary examination of the lab. And according to these records, one of the first things investigators had found inside of that lab was 5 vials of thallium in one of the storerooms. They'd also found a rag that was laying out on a countertop that presumably was there when Bobby first arrived and he and his crew began cleaning everything up. And next to this rag was a handwritten note that had a warning on it that literally said, "Thallium wiping rag, touch me and die." The rag had actually caused a huge amount of panic amongst the investigators when they had gone in to begin sweeping the lab for signs of thallium, because people were fearful that maybe they'd brushed up against it and touched this rag, and were they going to get thallium poisoning? However, they actually tested the rag and it came back negative for thallium, as did all the surfaces in the lab and also the air in the lab. And so the investigators had finally decided that that note must have been a joke or something. Also, the university insisted that all of its thallium was accounted for, meaning none of it could have been, stolen or misused in some way to poison Bobby because they would know about it. And so at this point, the university had actually been sort of ruled out as where Bobby got poisoned, which really didn't make sense to Detective Curley or the other investigators at this dinner, because again, thallium is hard to come by. The idea that Bobby was working in a lab that contained thallium, but that wasn't where he was poisoned by thallium, seemed almost impossible. It had to have happened there. But they had gone out and tested all of Bobby's coworkers who had also worked in that lab with Bobby for so many days and so many hours, and they all came back negative for thallium exposure. However, Bobby's own family, his wife Joanne and her 4-year-old daughter Angela, they had tested positive for thallium exposure. Granted, it was on a near microscopic level because any amount of exposure could actually be lethal, and those two were okay, so obviously they had not received a lethal dose, but there were very small traces of thallium in both of them, which was odd. And so everybody at the table agreed that the right thing to do here was to speak to Joanne and see if maybe she had some ideas of how she and her daughter and obviously Bobby could have maybe come in contact with this very rare and lethal chemical. And then also, they need to get inside of the family's duplex to search it, literally, for thallium. But first, there was the problem of jurisdiction. Bobby had died in Hershey, but he'd gotten sick in Wilkes-Barre. So, after some discussion, the men decided that the Wilkes-Barre police should be the ones to head up the case because that is where Bobby actually got poisoned. The next day, Detective Curley invited Bobby's siblings, David and Suzanne, to the Wilkes-Barre police station. And right away, it was quite clear that both of them were very suspicious of Bobby's wife, Joanne. They told Curley that Joanne had been acting really strange for months, both before and also after Bobby's death. David said when his brother had first gotten sick, Joanne had barely lifted a finger to help him. She'd called David to come over and look after Bobby, acting like she needed somebody strong enough to move Bobby around, which was true. But while David was upstairs literally carrying Bobby to and from the bathroom, Joanne stayed downstairs with her daughter and totally ignored them. She didn't even pretend to want to help. She basically let David do all of it. And Susan said, even though she didn't know for sure, her impression of Joanne right after she had taken Bobby off life support and he's died, her impression of Joanne was she was hugely relieved. Curley listened and nodded and sort of gave the impression that he was following along and basically believed them. But inside, he wasn't really convinced that what they were describing was highly suspicious behavior. When David came over to help Bobby, that was because she had asked him to do that, after trying at first unsuccessfully to move her husband around. And then when David was there, she does have a 4-year-old daughter. She can't just leave her unsupervised. Or maybe she doesn't want her daughter to see Bobby, and so she has to keep her downstairs. So there's an explanation for that. And as for Joanne being relieved after her husband's death, everybody dealt with grief differently. And Bobby's death had been a really traumatic, drawn-out process for everybody involved. So maybe she was relieved, but not because she was happy about it. It could have just been the end of a nightmare chapter in all of their lives. And so after he had listened to their concerns, Curley began to redirect the conversation, and he began asking David and Susan about their relationship with Bobby. They both said they were very close with their brother, even as adults. They said they lived nearby, and they saw each other quite a bit. David in particular said he spent a lot of time with Bobby. He said they often went fishing, and recently, together, they had renovated Bobby's kitchen. And this caught Curley's attention, because it sounded like David and Bobby had finished this renovation project around the same time that Bobby first got sick. Curley didn't know if this was relevant or not, but it was interesting. So at the end of their discussion, he just thanked David and Susan for all the information and told them they were free to go. A few days later, on the morning of October 25th, 1991, Detective Curley and 3 other investigators sat at an interrogation table in the Wilkes-Barre police station, right across from Joanne Curley, and the lawyer that she had brought along with her. Curley didn't know what to make of Joanne yet. Obviously, she and her daughter had also been exposed to thallium, so that could mean that they too accidentally were exposed to this chemical, same as Bobby, but obviously on a much smaller scale because they lived. Or they could have also been the target of somebody trying to poison this family, and ultimately just Bobby was killed from this poisoning. Or Joanne could be the poisoner. She could have poisoned her own husband. I mean, Bobby's siblings are talking about how awful Joanne was acting towards her husband in the wake of his illness. Maybe she poisoned him. And in doing so, she accidentally exposed herself and her daughter. Basically, Curley couldn't tell yet if Joanne was a victim or a perpetrator. So he made sure to watch her very carefully while another investigator began asking her to explain how and when her husband first got sick. Joanne said that Bobby had been complaining about feeling pretty run down for what felt like weeks or maybe even months, but he hadn't had any major symptoms until a week before his hospitalization in August. And she said that much like Bobby, she had just kind of chalked it up to he had been overworking, or maybe he had some standard illness that would just go away with rest, like that first doctor had said. She said that she had never even heard of thallium, and really at no point had it ever crossed her mind that maybe Bobby had been poisoned by thallium. As Curley listened to Joanne tell this story, he was struck by a couple of things. First of all, Joanne said Bobby had been feeling pretty run down for a while before his death. This seemed to conflict with investigators' assumption that a single massive dose of thallium had sent Bobby to the hospital and ultimately killed him. It seemed more likely, based on what Joanne said, that this poisoning happened over a period of time. And the second thing Curley was struck by was actually just Joanne's general demeanor. She had just recounted in detail, the story of her husband dying, this awful, awful death. Thallium poisoning is a horrible way to die. And as she's describing it, she's not shedding a single tear or really acting at all like she's even upset about it. And so at this point, Curley was beginning to wonder if maybe Susan and David had been right about Joanne. She really did not seem to care much about her husband's death. And so what Curley did is he stopped the other investigator and he leaned forward and he just asked Joanne point blank, how do you explain how you and your daughter were exposed to thallium? And immediately, Joanne had a story, a bizarre one. She said Bobby really liked to drink iced tea when he was at work. So every morning, she would fill his thermos up from this big pitcher of pre-made iced tea that she kept in their fridge. And so Bobby would take that thermos with him to work and he would drink the tea all day and then come home with the thermos. And some days when he would come back, Bobby had not drank all the iced tea. There'd be some left inside the thermos. And so Joanne said what she would do in that case was she would take the remaining iced tea still in the thermos and she would pour it back into the pitcher in the fridge, basically to salvage what was left of the tea. And she said she and her daughter also drank from that pitcher. So in essence, she sometimes was drinking from the same tea that Bobby was drinking from directly. And so perhaps in that way, if he was being exposed to thallium, maybe it was getting into that tea that he was bringing home. And, she believed that maybe that was how she was being exposed, by drinking the leftover iced tea. Curley glanced over at the other investigators in the room, and they all looked as baffled as he was. This iced tea explanation was pretty out there, but it was so weirdly specific that they really couldn't write it off. And Curley knew that, if the iced tea theory was legitimate, it might be able to explain why all 3 people in this family, all living in the same place, had such drastically different levels of exposure. Basically, Bobby could be having this huge exposure to thallium outside the house, and then basically remnants of the thallium exposure are finding their way back into that leftover tea, so it's a really small amount of thallium. That's coming back home, it's being mixed inside that pitcher, and so when Joanne and her daughter are drinking from that pitcher, they're only getting a very small amount of thallium. And so again, it's out there, but it would explain it. So Curley asked Joanne if he had her permission to not just search her whole duplex to check for thallium, but specifically check her fridge, check her pitcher, her iced tea pitcher, and all the thermoses that Bobby brought to work to see if there was still trace levels of thallium inside of them. And he was worried when he asked her this question that she might refuse or give some reason that she couldn't, but Joanne immediately agreed without any hesitation. That same afternoon, Curley, his investigators, and a crime scene unit arrived at the Curley's duplex to begin their search. Curley looked on as the crime scene unit entered the duplex and immediately began scouring every surface. And they found absolutely no trace of thallium anywhere in the house, except for in one very specific location. The thermos Joanne had already told them about, the one that Bobby would bring with the iced tea in it to work and then back again. Traces of thallium were found on the little ridges at the top of the thermos where the lid screwed back on. And this was huge, not only because now they had the first clear sign of exactly where the thallium was coming in and out of Bobby's life, but more specifically because it was at the top of this cup that obviously Bobby is drinking from. This showed that the way the thallium wound up in Bobby's system was because he ingested it. That was something they didn't know at this point. Now it seems very clear that's how it happened. But despite this revelation, it didn't explain how Joanne and Angela were also exposed, because when they tested the big pitcher of iced tea in the fridge, it didn't contain any thallium. And also, just finding the thallium at the top of the thermos didn't explain how it actually got there. But for Curley, what really stood out about finding thallium on this thermos was that this item, this thermos, is something Bobby took to work and home every single day. So it seemed like maybe, Curley and his staff had been too quick to rule out where Bobby was working. I mean, he was working in a chemical lab that contained thallium, and they had ruled that out as the place where he could have been poisoned. Now, it seemed like they needed to take another look. Seven months later, in late May of 1992, Detective Curley sat at his desk, thumbing through the notes from all the interviews and polygraph tests that he and his team had carried out since the previous October. One by one, they had brought in all of Bobby's coworkers and grilled them about Bobby's death. And all of the coworkers had more or less said the same thing. Bobby was well-liked, and nobody they knew would want to harm him. Some of the coworkers did admit that they did like to prank each other a lot, but they said the pranks had always been, pretty harmless, and spiking somebody's drinks with chemicals was way, way beyond anything they ever did. At least, that's what all of them said. But two of Bobby's coworkers, Sammy DePasquale and Robert Marconi, had failed their polygraph exams. In fact, the polygraph examiner said those two had literally gotten the worst scores he had ever seen. So very quickly, those two shot to the top of Curley's suspect list. And so Curley had pressed both of them about whether or not they had pranked Bobby by putting thallium into his thermos. Maybe they didn't know how dangerous thallium was, but did they put something in his thermos? And they said absolutely not, they didn't do that. But Curley didn't believe them, because he'd already heard about previous pranks that involved swapping out coworkers' drinks for things like tobacco spit. So what's to say they didn't put thallium in Bobby's thermos? It just sort of tracked. The problem was, Curley didn't have any actual evidence that he could use to arrest either of them, especially since the university continued to insist that none of their thallium was missing from the lab. Now, Curley knew it was possible the university was wrong, that maybe there was unaccounted for thallium, but he had no way to prove that. Curley also felt pretty suspicious of Joanne and also Bobby's own brother, David. Joanne, for obvious reasons, was still suspicious. She had thallium in her system. She seemed oddly detached from Bobby when he was dying, kind of letting other people take care of him, and apparently was relieved when he was taken off life support. But even if Joanne had wanted to poison Bobby, it was really unclear how she would have gotten her hands on thallium. And then as for David, the reason he was sort of suspicious to Curley is because he spent a lot of time with Bobby. And he also did that kitchen renovation with him. And so there's all these moments where he's alone, potentially handling chemicals with Bobby before he got sick. So basically, David had the opportunity to poison Bobby, but there really was no motive. And just like with Joanne, Curley felt like, where would David get the thallium? That was the big question. Where is the thallium coming from? And so at this point, Detective Curley was basically at a dead end and just did not know how to take this case, which was heartbreaking because earlier that day, he'd been informed that the district attorney had decided to actually shut down the investigation into Bobby's death. The case was officially cold. And so since Curley could not revive it, all he could do was close the case file and stick it in a drawer. One morning in August of 1994, so more than 2 years after the investigation into Bobby's death was shut down, Detective Curley walked up the porch steps of the duplex where Bobby had lived, and he knocked on the door. Curley had been thinking a lot about this case recently, and today he was hoping that Bobby's widow, Joanne, would help him take one last shot at cracking it. A moment later, Joanne answered the door, and once the look of surprise left her face, she invited the detective inside. Curley quickly explained to her that the reason he was here is because there had been this technological breakthrough in toxicology testing. The Wilkes-Barre police were now able to perform a new type of test that had not been available to them 3 years ago when her husband had died. And Curley believed that, this information they could get would help them figure out what actually happened to Bobby once and for all. Joanne's eyes lit up at this news, and she was about to open her mouth to reply, but Curley quickly added there was actually a catch. He said in order to do these tests, they would have to exhume Bobby's body. And the only person who could give investigators permission to do that was Joanne. Curley waited while Joanne processed everything she had just been told. He tried not to let it show on his face, but Joanne's response to this would basically decide the entire fate of this case. If she said no, there really was nothing they could do. The evidence contained inside of Bobby's casket would be lost to them forever, which meant if somebody had intentionally poisoned Bobby, they would never figure out who it was, and so the killer would never be brought to justice. But unsurprisingly, Joanne said yes, of course. Later that month, on August 23rd, Curley went to the cemetery where Bobby was buried, and he watched as a backhoe dug up his grave and pulled his casket out of the ground. The police and coroner then took custody of Bobby's body, and they would go on to perform these new toxicology tests. And when the results came in, they gave Curley the exact information he had hoped for. Based on the police investigation, and critically, those new toxicology tests, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Bobby Curley. The first time the killer slipped thallium into Bobby's thermos, Bobby was busy working in another room and didn't notice, which was exactly what the killer wanted. The killer did not hate Bobby. In fact, they really hadn't wanted to kill him until he had started talking about opening up his own business with that settlement money his family was going to get. And the killer just could not let that happen. Because if Bobby went into business for himself, he would ruin everything. The killer believed that by poisoning Bobby one time, that would kill him, and then all their problems would be solved. But the next day, Bobby actually seemed fine, sort of unfazed by the poison. So the next time the killer got the chance, they added a little more poison to Bobby's thermos. And when Bobby again stayed healthy the next day, well, the killer just added a little bit more the next time, and they just kept on doing that. They were afraid that if they added too much at once, Bobby might notice, and then they would get caught. So, for months, Bobby was being poisoned, but didn't really show any significant symptoms. But finally, in August of 1991, Bobby started showing really severe symptoms. Remember, his legs were in extreme pain, his hands were going numb, and when he called in sick to work on that Monday, that was when the killer knew. They were certain they had finished him off. Except they hadn't finished him off. Because when he went to the hospital, Bobby just continued to cling to life. So the killer actually went to visit Bobby in the hospital, and while Bobby was sleeping, the killer slipped a final, massive amount of the poison into a soda cup that Bobby kept by his bedside. And when Bobby woke up, the killer kind of casually encouraged him to drink the soda, and Bobby did so without any hesitation because Bobby had no reason not to trust the killer. Because the killer was his own wife, Joanne Curley. She had actually started poisoning him almost a year before she actually murdered him. But investigators didn't realize this until a new type of toxicology test allowed them to figure out exactly when Bobby was being poisoned. This test worked by analyzing some of the hairs that Bobby still had left on his body. Basically, every time Bobby was poisoned, a chemical marker was left behind in his hair. So as his hair grew out, the strands sort of became timelines that showed exactly when he had been poisoned. And when Curley, through these tests, discovered that Bobby had been poisoned multiple times between October 1990 and September of 1991, these dates ruled out Bobby's coworkers and his brother David. The poisoning had simply started too early for David to be responsible and went on far too long for his coworkers to be guilty. But the timeline clearly ruled in Joanne. And when police began digging into why Joanne might have wanted to kill her husband, they realized she'd convinced Bobby to make her the beneficiary of his life insurance policy just days before poisoning him for the very first time. And so Joanne's motive was money. She did not want Bobby to have any of that financial windfall she was going to get from the death of her earlier husband, the wrongful death lawsuit where she was going to get $1 million, even though she kind of acted like, oh yeah, Bobby's going to use some of that to start his business. She didn't want that. She did not want him to have any of it. That was her money. So that was one motivation financially, and the other financial motivation was by killing Bobby, she would also receive the life insurance payout. As for where Joanne actually got the thallium, she would admit that she had used an old container of rat poison that did contain thallium that was manufactured in the US before thallium was banned in household products. On December 12, 1996, 5 years after Bobby's death, Joanne was finally arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Joanne ultimately pled guilty and so was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. She would wind up serving all 20 years and was released from prison in 2016.